The Gospel of John is just different. It's different, and it never ceases to amaze me when I read the Gospel of John how different it is. It's not like any other book of the Bible. It's not even like very much the 3 letters of John, though they were clearly written by someone who was very close to the author of the Gospel of John. John doesn't sound like other books in the Bible. And in fact, when you hear a passage read from the Gospel of John, you can tell almost immediately it's John, because it doesn't sound like anything else. It's just different. And it's different in all kinds of ways, some of them obvious and some of them not so obvious. Content-wise, it's different even from the other Gospels. But it's not just the content that's different, it's the language itself. Of course, the Gospel is written in Greek like all the other books of the New Testament, but John's Greek is different from everyone else's. For one thing, it's simpler. John is what you read when you take Greek in seminary. It's the first thing you try to read. But John's Greek is different in other ways as well. Because in John, words take on meanings and depths of meaning that they just don't have anywhere else. Words that in any other book of the Bible would be just plain old ordinary words, in John sometimes become very special words. So special that it almost seems at times as if John is written in code. Now, we have a good example of what I'm talking about in our gospel lesson from John this morning. There's a word that is used here, and used repeatedly within the space of just a few verses. Though unfortunately, because the English version we have uses several different English words to translate this one Greek word, you really don't see that it's one and the same word being used over and over again. In fact, altogether, our Bible uses nearly a dozen different English words in the Gospel of John to translate this one Greek word. The English words that are most often used to translate this word are these. Most common is abide, second, remain, third, stay, and fourth, continue. All of these are words that convey the sense of going somewhere and then staying there. Staying put, remaining there, abiding there, continuing there. All of them, again, meaning you don't leave. And once you begin to notice how much John does use this word, you will begin to see it everywhere. And then you can't help but ask yourself, what's going on here? What's so special about this word for John? I mean, anywhere else, it's just an ordinary word and nothing particularly special at all. So why for John is this notion of going somewhere and then staying, not leaving, but staying, why does that mean so much to him? Now, the word is used in our passage today in 2 places, one of them right after the other. The first is when John the Baptist is talking about something remarkable that happened when Jesus came to him to be baptized. John, and here I mean John the Baptist, not John the author of the gospel, John is describing what it was that had happened. Suddenly, he sees Jesus coming his way. And he says to this person he's talking to that this is the guy I was just telling you about. And then he goes on to say, actually the gospel says he testified, which is a very special word for John. He testified that he saw the Spirit descending upon Jesus out of heaven like a dove. He saw the Spirit descending upon Jesus out of heaven like a dove. All four of the Gospels tell us that. But John says something more. John tells us that not only did the dove come down out of heaven, but that it settled on Jesus and stayed there. And why is that so important? Well, because John goes on to say, the one who sent me, another one of those special words in John, the one who sent me told me that he on whom you see the Spirit descend and remain is the one. Descend and remain. Stay put. It's that word. Now, I'll grant you that would be a pretty unusual sight. I mean, how many times have you ever seen something like that happen? Seen a bird landing on somebody and then just sitting there? Not very often, I would imagine. But still, so what? What's the fact that the dove stayed on Jesus supposed to mean? Granted, it would suggest that he's a very special person. I get that. But what more does it mean than that? And while you're still wondering about all this, just why all of this is so important to John, the story then moves on to something that happened the very next day. John the Baptist is once again talking to someone, this time to two of his own disciples. And once again, he sees Jesus walking toward him, and he points him out to his disciples, saying that Jesus is the Lamb of God. Yet another very special word in John. Well, the two disciples then follow Jesus. And when he sees them following him, he asks them, "What are you looking for?" And they respond with what may seem at first to be a rather peculiar question. They ask him, "Where are you staying?" It's that word again. To which Jesus responds, "Come and see." Nothing more than that, just come and see. And sure enough, the gospel tells us they came, they saw, and they stayed. They stayed where Jesus was staying, just like the dove stayed. Same word. Now, if you're paying attention at all here, by now you know that something is going on, that there's got to be some reason why John, now the gospel writer, not John the Baptist, why John is so focused, so concerned with this business of staying. The fact that the dove stayed on Jesus, the fact that the disciples stayed with Jesus. But why? Why is this so important to John? Well, I suspect that the only way for us to truly answer that question is for us to come and see. For us, not just to open the pages of the gospel and read it, but to come more fully into John's world and try to see there why it's so important to him that someone stays or doesn't. I say that because if you do enter into John's gospel, if you do read the gospel and dwell within the gospel, one of the things you will certainly see is just how many people came and saw and didn't stay. And some of those who didn't stay were a number of people who very early on considered themselves to be followers of Jesus, and yet later found the path of discipleship to be just too hard, and so they left. They didn't stay. And when you read the letters of John, you see that this problem did not end with the death and resurrection of Jesus, but continued to plague that very special community which had gathered around the beloved disciple. Because there too people came and they saw and they left. They didn't stay. Because the challenge of living a truly Christian life in a community of people genuinely committed to doing so, a life that very often put them at odds with the world around them, at times with even their own family, even with other Christians, that life had just proved to be too hard. So they left. They didn't stay. Which is why those who did stay remain such a small, struggling, and fragile community. Because not very many stayed. And I think that's why, for John, this whole business of someone staying or not was such a big deal. But honestly, I can see why they left, why they chose not to stay. Because the fact is that living a truly Christ-like life, not just a reasonably decent life, but a Christ-like life, and doing so not just on Sunday morning and the occasional day of service, but doing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, and doing it for the rest of your life, that's tough. That's way hard. For most of us, frankly, it's just too hard. Which is why we can talk a good game. We can say all the right things. We can express all the right opinions. But when push comes to shove, and it's no longer just a matter of saying it, but having to do it, and what is more, doing it day in and day out, and honestly, most of us begin to fade. We don't stay. We just don't stay. And in fact, I think that's one of the reasons that we still have so far to go in the struggle to overcome the history and legacy of racial prejudice that continues to plague this country. Now, we have certainly made considerable progress in this regard, and those among us who say that we haven't are just flat out wrong. We've made enormous progress in some areas, as those of us who are old enough to remember the way things were as recently as the 1950s can testify. And I'm one of those people, and I testify that things have changed. Many things have changed very much for the better. But for the most part, all of those kinds of things tend to be structural things, the kind of things that can be changed by passing a law. And it's important to do that. But that's not the same as changing people's attitudes. Now, people's attitudes have changed too, but not nearly enough. And I think that's the problem. Because we are still a long way from having achieved what I think all of us would say is our goal, and that is a truly race-neutral society. A society that has been purged entirely of the terrible poison of racial prejudice. But friends, doing that is hard. especially when it comes to changing not just laws, but people's hearts. Because it's never easy to change someone's heart, especially not when it's something that is so deeply ingrained within us as racial prejudice is. But then, being Christ-like is never all that easy either. And at times that, too, may prove very costly. But still, it's what we're called to do. And I think if we just hang in there, if we just keep working on it, if we just stay at it, then we can do it. We can one day eliminate the curse of prejudice that still clings to us today. And I think that's exactly what John was talking about, and why it was so important for him who was willing to stay at it. Because he was convinced that to those who do stay at it, to those who do hang in there, to those who do keep trying, Christ has given power to become children of God, children born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And as children of God, no matter how stony the road, no matter how bitter the rod, no matter how weary our feet, we will stay at it. We will stay at it for as long as it takes, and one day we shall overcome. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor, now and forever.